Hi everyone, thank you for joining this session, Healthy You, Healthy Planet, Key Considerations for Practice. I'm Dr. Danielle McCarthy from Queen's University Belfast. I work within the Institute for Global Food Security, and it's our mission to promote global food integrity from soil to society. And we focus this via working on three key challenge areas: farms of the future, global food integrity, and food nutrition and health. And really this slide is actually an important one to convey because it's so linked to the topic at hand today in terms of healthy you, healthy planet. There's some really complex issues at hand, and we have to address these by bringing the different disciplines together that perhaps traditionally nutrition science didn't interact as closely with those working within agriculture, within environmental science, for example. So it's really about trying to pull together and answer these complex challenges by looking at holistically from different perspectives to really help solve them. The talk today, I'll start by presenting some of the latest research with a focus on some of the recommendations that have been formed in this area, as I think they'll be most useful to you in your work. I'll then take you through a couple of examples of applying some of these concepts and the complex realities of trying to do that. And we'll finish up by discussing some of the key challenges and opportunities as I see them, and hopefully that will stimulate you guys to come up with some solutions to these challenges, and how can we maintain our own health as well as that of the planet. So from a nutrition science perspective, there are many different facets of nutrition science. You can look at the impact of food and health from a specific demographic, so whether or not you're looking at pregnant women or children or at-risk populations, or you can look at nutrition science from specific food groups or specific nutrients perspective, or indeed there are lots of different methods you can use to explore how food impacts our health. So it's a very complex science, and dependent on what angle you take, there are many different ways of exploring the relationship between food and health. So taking this quite complicated science with lots of different facets to it and combining it with environmental science is kind of where we're at the moment. And it's a very exciting time because obviously, as much as there are different facets to nutrition science, that is exactly the same for environmental science. And I guess where we're starting to pull things together is whereby there's been a lot that has been done within environmental science recently, which is looking at the impact that different diets have on life cycle based footprints. So be that climate, land and water use, but it's a method of trying to understand the impact of different foods on the environment. And we want to try and work these two areas more closely together, because actually that is the only way we're going to be able to understand exactly how to have a healthy diet from a nutrition perspective, but also one that is sustainable and protects our planet for the future. So in terms of nutrition science, what we eat absolutely impacts our mortality and our morbidity. So we can see from the data here that across lots of different regions, one of the key areas that drives mortality and morbidity is diets low in fruits. We can also see high dietary salt is there, alcohol use, as well as diets that are low in nuts and seeds, low in vegetables and low in whole grains, and low in fish and seafood. So quite often when we're talking about nutrition, and especially recently, a big focus has been on obesity and calorie intake and sugar intake. But actually what we cannot forget is the impact of some of those other food groups that actually are currently low. We're not eating enough of those fruits and those vegetables, those nuts and those seeds and those whole grains to provide the nutrients that we need to protect our health and prevent disease. Then when it comes to the evidence base for the impact of food on the environment, last year this publication in The Lancet received a lot of attention. It was written by very high profile scientists. There was 19 commissioners and they worked alongside 18 other co-authors, and they were from 16 different countries. They used a food systems model approach to try to quantify, so to use numbers and a model to define what a universally healthy reference diet should look like. They set a framework and targets to try to define a win-win diet, so a diet that is healthy and environmentally sustainable. And here we can see some of the environmental data that they base their recommendations on. So you can see each graph reflects an aspect of environmental impact, and each different food group is assessed across those different definitions of environmental impact. And what you can see here is that ruminant meat, pork and chicken across most come out as having a greater impact than food groups such as cereals and fruit and nuts. So it will come as no surprise then that the recommendation that they came up with was to ultimately lower dairy food intakes and animal source protein. And here you can see their recommendations in terms of micronutrient intakes against the different food groups and the calorie intakes against the different food groups. So this research was not without its criticism. That criticism was very much within the concern that it didn't reflect cultural food habits and that it would be at the destruction of cultural practices, that if everybody was to move to one particular diet. It was also challenged that it was based on assumptions and associations rather than on intervention trials that specifically test the relationship and the impact of one food group and replacing it with another food group. And there was also some criticism that it might not actually reflect optimum nutrition intakes. If you compare that to this research by Paragon et al. In 2016, we can see that they reviewed a lot of data that was based on dietary intakes rather than using a theoretical model. And from looking at this, they were able to map how reducing energy intake could be a main factor in reducing diet-related greenhouse gas emissions. So from the data that was collected in nearly 2,000 people in the INCA 2 study in France, they were able to model if food consumption was altered to match the estimated energy requirements for everybody, then actually, if they achieved that, that would lead to a 10% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions without the need to modify habitual diets. In this review, they very much spoke to those self-selected diets, which does allow observation of real food choices over those theoretical dietary patterns of the Eat Lancet report. And by looking and categorising the dietary intakes as they were reported into those that naturally tended to have a more sustainable diet compared to the average diet, they were able to see what food groups was that different energy coming from. So in those with a more sustainable diet, less energy was coming from drinks, less energy was coming from mixed dishes, less energy was coming from pork, poultry, eggs and deli meat, and from ruminant meat, whereas they were getting more of their energy from starchy foods, more of their energy from fruits, vegetables and nuts. So this approach is one that does account for that cultural acceptability. It's based on real life diets, for want of a better expression, and it shows that more sustainable diets can be achieved and how they are achieved. The review did, however, note that there are a low number of studies out at the moment that have considered nutritional adequacy of environmentally focused diets. So this really is an upcoming area of research of pulling together that nutrition science and that environmental science together, but it's starting, and these are some of the most recent data. The British Dietetic Association has reviewed the data that is available to date and come up with their own recommendations. And here we can see them. Some of them are aligned to the Eat Lancet report and others go a little bit further. So they bring in things like food waste and hydration and also portion control. But what do we do with these recommendations? How can we think about applying them, and what challenges might we face? Well, ultimately, we know from research that what people eat depends on many different factors. Price, absolutely. Culture, knowledge, their usual habits, cooking confidence, as well as time, where people are, who they are with, and how we all feel, absolutely impact what we choose to eat, what we choose to cook. So if you consider your family's own spaghetti bolognese or the product that you have in the marketplace, but go with me on this example of the spaghetti bolognese. Thinking about what type of spaghetti you would use, thinking about if you would use meat, and if so, how much. If you would use cooking oil, what sort of oil? Would you add vegetables? What type and how much? What drink would you choose to have with your spaghetti bolognese? And all of those factors will impact both the nutrition quality of the meal that you make, but also its potential environmental impact. So you can see there how there are many routes to alter the impact that you could have, both from a business perspective, but also as a consumer of food perspective. But what we can't forget is the importance of the portion that you serve. So quite often this can be overlooked in modelling practices of the impact of certain diets. It's a difficult thing to model and to measure. So it's not that it's forgotten, it's a very challenging thing to be able to do. But ultimately, if you think about how you would serve yourself, what I want to demonstrate here is that dependent on what portion you would serve, it will really significantly impact the nutrition of the meal. So you can see here between the smallest and the largest portion, there is nearly doubling of the calories and near 5 times as much saturated fat. So we know that portion is a great way of trying to manage nutritional intakes effectively. If you then consider some of the recipe adaptations that you might consider after reading those British Dietetic Association or the Eat Lancet guidelines, there are a number of different things you could choose. You could use to have it as originally with beef bolognese, more traditional recipe. You could use corn, you could switch the mince for lentils, or you could do a half and half mix of beef and lentil bolognese. And what I want to pull out for you here is the impact that this can have on the nutrition quality when we look at those micronutrients. So we heard up front that actually micronutrients are really, really important. And here we can see that by removing some of the meat within the dishes, there are impacts on vitamin B12 and on the iron levels. So all of these impacts, as well as those on the energy and the saturated fat and the salt that you will see, are important to consider. And those are the elements that are currently not necessarily always being factored in to the analysis that is being done on deciding what the target should be for food intakes. And it's really just driving home the point here that nutrition quality is a very important consideration. And there's concerns that if changes only focus on improving the environmental burdens, it might not help us fulfill all of our micronutrient needs, which we know are already an issue. And very much in practice, the issues there with food, it's not like pharma where you can stop taking something or just start taking something. Within our dietary patterns, it tends to be that if we stop eating one thing, we will replace it with something else. And that's what makes nutrition science so complicated. And actually this work by Paragon talks about this and gives a really good example of when all the meat and dairy that people had reported they were consuming, when they modelled that they were replaced with plant-based products, what did they find? Well, they found land use was halved, saturated fatty acid intake was decreased by 4%, and total iron intake increased by 2.5 milligrams per day. So, those are great. But we have to look at it in balance. And 10% of the total iron in the original diet was from heme iron, which we know is more bioavailable. Whereas when all of the meat and dairy foods were replaced by plant-based products, all of the iron then came from non-heme iron, which has much lower bioavailability. And we know that iron is a key need, especially for teenage girls within the UK. So we can't overlook some of those micronutrients. They're very, very important for our nutrient adequacy. The authors also pointed out the probable increase in sugar intake due to the high sugar content of some of the replacement foods. So this example was a ham sandwich into a peanut butter sandwich, but they also talked about some jam sandwiches, for example. So, you know, it's not to be assumed that a better diet from an environmental perspective always reflects a better diet from a nutrition perspective. And equally, the authors did conclude that meat reduction per se does not necessarily always lead to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, because we really have to consider what the replacement food is. And we've seen this before. It's why nutritionists get a bad rep. You know, one of the key examples of this is butter, and the difference findings that have come out of research, but ultimately a lot of this is down to what replaced butter in the different studies. And looking at data from over 340,000 individuals that had over 5,000 cardiac heart disease events, we can see that actually when saturated fats like butter were replaced with polyunsaturated fatty acids, there was a significant decrease in the coronary heart disease risk. Whereas when those saturated fats were replaced with carbohydrates, there was an increase in the risk. So we really do need to consider carefully when we're giving advice to reduce and to change or to lower or to increase certain food groups. What are the other food groups? What are the other changes that happen? And make sure that we are holistically looking at the situation and future-proofing, looking at it from all angles in terms of the nutritional adequacy of the whole change that will happen. And there's some really exciting results actually that came out from Sonneson, a Swedish group, last year. And this is some work that we are looking into at the Institute. And really they started to demonstrate the possibility of assessing global warming potential of different foods using nutritional environmental assessments and nutrition quality scores, which look at a range of different nutrients, which is great, but also in the context of dietary intakes. So they have developed a dietary dependent nutrient quality index, which looks to compare the impact of those different foods, but bringing in the context of an unhealthy Swedish diet with an average Swedish diet. And the results showed that the environmental performance of single products was strongly affected by their dietary contexts when expressed in terms of those nutrient quality indexes that they had developed. And that's not unsurprising. You know, ultimately, if a diet is poor in vitamin A, a product that is rich in vitamin A should have a higher nutritional value. Equally, if a product's high in calcium, it would have little extra value in a dairy-rich diet. So this is a really interesting and novel way of looking at this area that it is very important and speaks to some of those key dietary pattern issues that I have been talking about. So hence why it is an area of real interest for us. It also makes sure that recommendations would come out that are based on the realities of people's diets rather than the ideals. And ultimately, you know, we know with the current situation of our triple burden of malnutrition that, you know, we don't live in that ideal world. So hopefully this kind of approach does recognise that move within nutrition research that is to consider dietary patterns alongside foods, and will hopefully make sure that recommendations that come out and metrics that are designed actually do have a more holistic approach. So then finishing up to think about what are the opportunities and challenges in this complex area. So acceptability is absolutely key. So this is linked wholeheartedly within food security. So it's about meeting people's food preferences, the appreciating consumers' own health beliefs and desires, making sure that options are affordable and accessible to all. And, you know, this is absolutely key. At the minute, a lot of the trends, as it were, are for vegan diets or plant-based eatings, and they are driven by certain socio-demographic groups, and certainly may not be appealing, accessible or affordable to everybody. And we absolutely are at a time of diet-related health inequalities widening, and we need to make sure that any future advances in this area bring everybody on that journey towards a sustainable, healthy diet. Then we have to absolutely think about that nutritional adequacy. So up front in this talk today, I presented to you those really clear findings of where we aren't getting enough of those some of those food groups. So those whole grains, those nuts and seeds, fruits and vegetables, and seafood. And that means that we are lacking in some of those key micronutrients, some of those key vitamins and minerals. So rather than just always focusing on what we need to reduce in our diets, we also need to think about what positive nutrition we need to put into our diets to help prevent disease. And some of those are absolutely aligned to those food groups that have come out as perhaps having less of an impact on the environment. In terms of how we do this, it's all about recipe adaptation. So playing with the proportioning of the different ingredients, considering replacements carefully, however, so as any replacement is actually going to ultimately lead to an overall benefit. And, you know, never to forget the impact of portion sizes. The British Heart Foundation, I remember, published a report on portion sizes and how they had changed between, I think it was 1993 and 2013. And there are some phenomenal, the Distortion report, there are some phenomenal examples there of how we have absolutely increased our portion sizes. So I think that is something worth not forgetting in all of these complex discussions, which tend to go and focus on a food group rather than the portion of foods that we eat. And then finally, you know, it's about what metrics, what will be the metrics? How can we avoid subjective conversations about this? And some targets, as I've shown, have already been published. There are methods that are coming through that I believe are more holistic in terms of how they will help set targets that are consider multiple different angles and look at nutrition in the round, but also are set in the real life dietary context in which people live, and which will, you know, hopefully make it more appropriate and lead to more effective change when it comes to nutritional intake. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done on those metrics, but ultimately they need to be developed to be able to guide the decisions and the activities that have to happen to ensure that we do have sustainable, healthy diets in the future. And then just to mention, I'm sure you are aware, but in case you're not, of the National Food Strategy, you know, ultimately when I'm saying about this, we need those metrics to inform some of these recommendations. We know the two key themes of the National Food Strategy review are to you know, make that our most disadvantaged children are not left behind. So it's all within that accessibility and that relevance and affordability. So to make sure that children get the nutrition that they need, be that those micronutrients, as well as then less of the nutrients that currently they're getting too much of. But it has to be done in a way that's relevant to all. The second area is about our standards, and you know, the report is very clear, and it's about ensuring high food standards, protecting the environment and being a champion of free trade. So certainly I think this topic is one that will only come more to the fore, but we do need to really focus and think carefully about how we do the research, how we measure it, and what informs some of those recommendations and best practice going forward. In terms of research considerations, it is an immense and complex challenge. We do need the quantitative data that does incorporate nutritional adequacy from multiple perspectives, looking at lots of different nutrients and lots of different food groups. And we need that to be able to inform decisions and to allow evidence-based recommendations. But it's not simple in terms of that dietary setup whereby one food will always be replaced by another. So you have to look at it from multiple angles. And then there is the lack of, or the only partial assessment, as I've said, of those nutritional quality in the replacement scenarios, and that might hide some nutritional inadequacy. So there's a lot of work to be done to really try and make sure we're exploring this in detail, and we learn the lessons of the past when it comes to nutrition science and the impact of certain recommendations if we only look at one nutrient at a time. And then finally, the assumptions cannot be made that diets lower in greenhouse gas emissions or in other markers of environmental impact are systematically healthy. It requires a much deeper understanding where that nutrition adequacy is front and center of any of the metrics that are being used. So thank you for joining me on this session. Please do get in touch. I'll be there for the Q&A. Don't hesitate to send me an email if you have any questions on the talk, or if you would like to get in touch from a research perspective. Also, in the interest of transparency, I want to note that I am also a co-founder and director of Nutrition Talent. So this is a consultancy and recruitment company for nutrition professionals. So if your business does require some more support and you'd like to get in touch with me from that perspective, then please do take a look at our website and contact me at info@nutritiontalent.com. I look forward to hearing your questions in the Q&A, and thank you for joining me at this session today.